abandoned Chernobyl nuclear plant will remain a threat for 3,000 years. Pripyat, Ukraine. Before the fire, the vomiting, the deaths and the vanishing home. It was the promise of bumper cars that captured the imagination of the boys. It will be 30 years ago Tuesday that Pripyat and the nearby Chernobyl nuclear plant became synonymous with nuclear disaster. That the word Chernobyl came to mean more than just a little village in rural Ukraine, and this place became more than just another spot in a shadowy Soviet Union. Even 30 years later, 25 years after the country that built it ceased to exist, the full damage of that day is still argued. Death toll estimates run from hundreds to millions. The area near the reactor is both a teeming wildlife refuge and an irradiated ghost-scape. Much of Eastern and Central Europe continues to deal with fallout aftermath. The infamous Reactor Number 4 remains a problem that is neither solved nor solvable. But on the night before their world changed, nothing seemed more important to the boys than shiny blue and yellow cars with actual steering wheels almost ready for a 10-year-old to drive. They knew they would have to wait till May 1, 1986. For the bumper cars to be turned on, a seemingly impossible to live through week away. So Alexander Sirota and his friends couldn't resist sneaking into the new park after dark. Beneath the deep shadows of the yet unblinking new Ferris wheel and under the inky dark of what would soon be the electrified roof over the bumper cars, we'd sit in the cars and make car noises, recalls Sirota, who's now 40. It was everything we could imagine wanting in life at that time. As young boys, our lives seemed perfect. It wasn't just the new bumper cars or the new amusement park. Their hometown, Pripyat, had been swampland 30 years before. Now it was a city built to serve the future. And the driver of that future was visible southeast of town, the four massive reactors of the Lenin nuclear power plant, which in common parlance was called Chernobyl. For a village some 9 miles distant, as the boys sat in the bumper cars, dreaming of the future, they knew what had to happen next. An adult would flip switches and draw some of the plentiful electricity a mile down the wires from the station, probably reactor number 4, as that was the nearest. The rest would be magic. Life would be magic. Those were the thoughts that consumed Sirota's dreams as he went to bed on April 25, 1986, and after he woke on April 26 and rushed off to school. No. 1. Looking back, it was the death of this dreamlike childhood that would come to haunt him, as much as the months of hospitalizations, as much as the Geiger counter that became his most common clothing accessory, as much as watching his mother's beautiful, long, blonde hair fall out in clumps. For Sirota, the worst nuclear accident in history didn't begin dramatically. That morning, he sat in class and contemplated how to best glue colored paper to a jar as a May Day gift for his mother. Someone came in the room and called our teacher, said it was an emergency meeting in the teacher's meeting room. Sirota recalls, we were told to study quietly. Of course we didn't. The teachers were gone forever. For more than an hour we sat around. I suppose they were trying to figure out what to do, and it wasn't an easy discussion. Something was wrong, but we didn't know exactly what. Slowly word filtered through the school that the meeting was about problems at the plant. The kids pressed their noses against the glass of the classroom windows to watch as, across the street on the manicured lawn of the city's new hospital, the first military helicopters landed. They were soon surrounded by a jumbled chaos of emergency vehicles. The kids opened windows and started shouting questions to those milling about on the street below. What happened? Have you seen it? Is that the army? But the adults didn't know much more. It was a fire at the nuclear plant. Someone used the word avaria, meaning accident. The aspen, birch, fir and oak trees in the small strip of forest outside the windows blocked their view. But the students knew there was a bridge just a short run away from which they could peer at the accident without obstruction. To kids, it was too tempting to pass up. Sirota recalls, he grabbed his jar, some paper and glue, evidence that he intended to work on the gift, and sprinted toward the plant. Sirota wasn't the first to reach the small bridge. which ran over rail lines on the south side of town, but he remembers that it wasn't yet crowded either. He remembers running up to the railing, half throwing himself in the way that boys do, eyes wide, hoping to see excitement. Instead, he saw smoke, and not enough to hold the attention of a 10-year-old for long. It looked more like fog than fire, he recalls. We were looking at the reactor, but we couldn't see any destruction. The bridge they were standing on wasn't yet known as the Bridge of Death. That would come later. Early that morning, just after 1 a.m., while those in Pripyat dosed the engineers who'd spent the previous 24 hours putting reactor number 4 through a stress test were getting nervous. The readings weren't right. The radiation levels were climbing too high. But the Soviet mindset at 1 a.m. on April 26, 1986, was very different from what it would be 24 hours later. In fact, the global perception of nuclear power was about to change. We knew with certainty, with arrogant certainty, that we were in control of the power we were playing with. We could make the forces of nature bend to our will. There was nothing we could not do, recalls Sergei Parisine, who'd been an engineer at the plant since 1977 and had arrived there within the hour. This was the day, of course, when we learned we were wrong. Parisine, who later would become the director of the complex and remains one of Ukraine's foremost experts on nuclear energy, says that as the dials indicated problems, the safe approach would have been to shut down the test. If we had, all would have been well, he says. That was not the course chosen. Later reports would call the staff inexperienced, poorly trained. But that was not how they perceived themselves, Parisine recalls. In their own minds, they were the best and the brightest, leading the way into a glorious future where power was abundant and life would have no limits. Their plant, after all, was only 16 years old. So as the radiation levels climbed, instead of stopping the test, those in charge ordered it to continue. They would find the limits and learn from that. And when they reached that limit, and the temperature inside the sealed reactor began to climb beyond expectations, Parisine says they did what seemed prudent. They hit what he calls the shutdown button. It turned out to be a huge mistake. Imagine you are driving a car quite fast and you see an obstacle in the road, he explains. Naturally, you hit the brakes to slow down and avoid the obstacle. But now imagine that the brakes have been wired incorrectly, and touching the brakes actually acts as an accelerator. When you try to slow down, you speed up into the obstacle. Chernobyl was built with this mistake. Had the operators done nothing, it would have been fine, it would have corrected itself, but they had no way to know this. Until this moment, even 30 years later, nuclear physicists familiar with the disaster disagree on what went wrong. The only area of agreement appears to be that somehow when the engineers attempted to slow the nuclear reaction by inserting control rods into the reactor core, the process actually sped up. It was a known flaw. Something similar had happened 3 years earlier during tests in Lithuania, and a warning had gone out, recalls Georgy Korpchinski, who on April 26, 1986, was a director of the Soviet Central Committee on Nuclear Energy. As he talks about Chernobyl, he wrings his hands, smokes nervously, and admits it's a very tough topic for him. We knew this, he says. 3 years earlier we'd sent out a warning to all plants with reactors with these absorbers, warning of this problem. But no actions had been taken. This was our arrogance at the time. We believed we were the masters of the atomic reactions. It was a horrible mistake. When Chernobyl's operators raised the control rods into the reactor to absorb the flying neutrons and slow down their reaction, the action took only about 15 seconds to complete. But in those seconds, the reaction, instead of slowing, sped up and the temperature inside the reactor reached 3,000 degrees, turning the water used to cool the uranium into steam. In the sealed environment of the reactor, the steam had no place to expand. That's when the roof blew, and an estimated 10 tons of the 200 tons of enriched uranium blasted into the atmosphere. After the roof blew, The walls collapsed and the superheated uranium melted and consumed all that fell into it. The long-term problem was forming a 2,000-ton mass of metal, concrete and uranium that was pooling below the reactor. But that was a long-term problem. The more immediate concern was the 10 tons of enriched uranium streaming into the atmosphere above Chernobyl, and spreading out in all directions over northern, eastern and central Europe. Eventually, a scientific report commissioned by the European Parliament would estimate that, to some extent, Chernobyl radiation contaminated 40% of Europe. The time was 1:23 a.m. The world had changed, but those sleeping just downwind had no idea. Read more here. http://www.miamihherald.com/news/nation-world/article 734058557.html #story link =CP